Okay, good morning and welcome to the 9th CSIS conference that examines China's power. My name is Bonnie Lin and I direct the China Power Project here at CSIS. This year, we're doing something different. We're co-hosting this conference with the two other CSIS programs on China. So the Freeman Chair, as well as the Trustee Chair in Chinese Economics, Business and Economics led by Scott Kennedy. Our gathering today comes at a very important time, only a couple weeks after our President Trump has assumed office, and it's a very important time to take stock in how we understand China, but also understanding the U.S.-China relationship. And we hope our conference today will help raise awareness on how should we understand China and how should we think about U.S.-China relations under the second Trump administration. Next slide, please. So our conference today is divided into 5 different portions. We're very grateful today that we have a keynote fireside chat with Representative Rob Whitman, which I'll welcome to the stage shortly. And then we're also, after that, we have 4 different panels. Each of the panel is constructed around a debate. And I will note that CSIS purposely chose 4 debate topics that are very provocative, and I think most people would disagree with at least one or more of the debate propositions. I also want to caveat that CSIS is not endorsing any of the particular debate topics, nor do we agree with any or all of the debate topics. And we believe that most would disagree with at least one, if not all of the debate topics. I will note that another feature of our debate is that while it's very important to be able to debate these issues internally in the United States, both publicly and privately among U.S. experts, one feature of our debate here today is that we have leading experts from China here today. So you'll see for each debate, we have a leading U.S. expert, and they're all former U.S. government experts paired with a leading expert from China. And we hope to use this debate to encourage direct conversation between the two sides. And while we may not always agree with each other, it's important to be able to have these types of debates publicly and to be able to inform the public about how each side views things differently. So with that, let me welcome Representative Whitman to the stage for the fireside chat. Thank you, really appreciate it. Before we launch into our conversation, and I'm very keen to hear your thoughts on both how to assess China's capabilities, but also U.S.-China relations, I think I should give you a round of introduction. We're really grateful for you to be here. As you know, since assuming office, President Trump has been very busy and very active, and he's also kept members of the Hill very busy too. So we know this is not easy for you to take time off. Yeah. But Representative Whitman was elected to the U.S. Congress to serve as Virginia's 1st congressional district in 2007, where he served on the House Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and Chinese Communist Party, and the House Armed Services Committee, where he serves as Vice Chairman of the Full Committee and Chairman of the Tactical Air and Land Forces Subcommittee, overseeing the largest portfolio of modernization programs on the House Armed Services Committee and on the House Natural Resources Committee, and serves on both the Energy and Minerals Committee as well as the Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries Committee, where he brings his professional expertise in water quality, fisheries, and other natural resource issues. He also has a very long, distinguished bio, which in the interest of time, I will skip to leave more time for his remarks, but also more of a conversation.
Sure.
So Representative, thank you again.
Well, Bonnie, thank you. It's an honor to be back here at CSIS, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about what I think is one of the most important issues the United States is going to have to deal with, and that is what is happening with China and their aggressive behavior around the globe. What we see is that the United States is, in many areas, playing catch-up. There is I think, an urgency that is in front of us now to make sure that we are doing things both economically and strategically to be able to counter China. You know, this really is about making sure that we maintain a peaceful world in the face of what China's doing to build a capacity. Listen, they are working around the world in many different ways to build their presence in different areas. We look at what's happening on the African continent, what's happening now in South America. Listen, they are transactional coercionists. And they're unapologetic about what they will do. I mean, we look at the threats that they face to us every day, the millions of cyber attacks that take place here. The Chinese are unapologetic. They will lie, cheat, and steal to achieve their means. And we need to make sure that we acknowledge that. That's not what we're going to do. But we need to understand that they will use any means possible in order to surpass the United States. Look at what they're doing in building an incredible base of industrial manufacturing within the defense realm. Our intelligence community estimates they spend north of $700 billion a year. It's always said, well, the United States spends more than the 16 other nations combined. We know China doesn't properly report what they spend, but we know it's about north of $700 billion. We know, too, the capacity that they have is incredible. If you look at it, they can build 232 ships for every one ship the United States can build. If you look at the total amount of shipyards, if you take all of our shipyards, every single one of them, and you combine that geographic footprint, it is larger than one of the largest Chinese shipyards. So we know that capability is there. We know by 2035, China's going to have 1,500 nuclear missiles with no nuclear arms limitation treaties, just unrestricted expansion of nuclear arsenal. That's a threat. That's a threat to the free world. And listen, there's a big contrast between the United States and our allies and China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Listen, that is a building axis of evil. The same thing is emerging today as we saw in 1938. And we ought to be very, very mindful of that and what China's looking to do to exert its influence around the world. Look at One Belt, One Road. Its purpose is to expand China's influence around the world. And we need to understand that. We need to be building more of our own economic capacity. Listen, and we can talk a little bit about tariffs. Tariffs have a role, but tariffs by themselves do not provide the opportunity for the United States to make sure that we are deterring China. I mean, our job is to make sure we are working with our allies. I would argue that we have deeper relationships with our allies than what China is now trying to develop with Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And we are not transactional in the things that we do. We look to have a longer lasting relationship there. And the bottom line, too, is the thing that distinguishes the United States and our allies is that the United States believes in the rule of law. China does not. The United States believes in the dignity and protecting human beings. China does not. They use forced labor. We also believe, too, that the resources that we have deserve protection. China does not. Go to China and see if you can breathe the air there. I mean, those are things that is a big contrast between the United States and China. That's what we have in common with other nations around the world that believe in the rule of law and that believe in the things that we believe in. And I think it's really that time in history, much like we saw in the late 1930s, where, the forces of good are going to have to stand up against the forces of evil. Pretty simple and straightforward.
So, Congressman, thank you for this very overarching remarks, everything from China's presence in Africa, Latin America, to China's nuclear capabilities, tariffs, as well as your casting of the overall China challenge and threat. Mm-hmm. I guess one question I have for you, taking a step back, is how would you view the direction that the United States is on vis-a-vis competition with China under a Trump administration versus the Biden administration? Sure. What do you see from the Congress in terms of major differences or similarities?
Sure. Well, listen, the major thing that we have to do is we have to devote more resources to building this nation's defense. We have to modernize our defense. So the reconciliation bill is going to be incredibly important about the additional dollars that we are going to have to spend in order to counter China. We have to make sure, too, that within our Department of Defense that we are much more efficient in how we use resources. We have to get more per our dollar than the Chinese get per their yuan. We have to make sure we expand what is our naturally based advantage, and that is innovation and creation. Now, the things that we're able to do, I think, are able to enable us to do more within this competitive realm. I think also making sure, too, that we understand the places where we're lagging behind. I mean, we have to have a different mentality. The United States has always had the mentality of looking in the rearview mirror. and that is seeing where we are and believing we're so far in front of everybody else, all we have to do is look in the rearview mirror and determine how far ahead we are. Well, folks, that's not the world we live in today. We live in a windshield world where the United States needs to look in the windshield because much of what we see, our adversaries are actually in front of us. And we have to not only look at see what's in front of us to make sure we counter that, but we have to take the next step. You know, we see the capabilities that we have. We see what China and others are doing to counter those capabilities. What we have to do is to say, okay, let's anticipate what the countermeasures from China will be, and let's make sure that we are creating countermeasures to those countermeasures. So we have to look further in the windshield. So instead of looking at the car in front of us in the windshield, we need to look 4 or 5 cars ahead to understand where things have to be. And again, this is a strategic competition. And the United States doesn't have unlimited resources, neither does anybody around the world. So the competition is not just about how much we spend, it's how we spend it. So reconciliation is going to be the key to make sure we get it to the proper places. How do we make sure we expand our capabilities in space, our capabilities in cyber, making sure too that we are pushing autonomy, making sure that we are looking at expendable and attritable platforms, and in addition to the exquisite platforms that we build. So all of those things, I think, are opportunities for us where we have a built-in advantage, and we have to do this with a sense of urgency. We have to do these things at the speed of relevance in being able to properly resource those things, and we find agreement across the spectrum. This is a bicameral, bipartisan effort to know the commitment that this nation needs to make in order to counter China.
And Congressman, you mentioned a couple of areas in your opening comments about what you're most worried about in terms of capabilities. You mentioned China's nuclear capabilities. Yeah. You mentioned China's massive shipbuilding capabilities, production, both production capabilities, but also its current number of ships. Yes. In terms of the capabilities that you think the United States military in particular needs to counter, would you list them among the top, or are there others that you would add to this list?
Well, I would look at it, if we just look at it and look at the asymmetric advantages that the United States has over China and some of the challenges that we face. If you look at it, we still have an advantage under the sea. But make no mistake about what China's doing to try to build nuclear submarines. We also have stealth and air superiority, so the things that we're able to do there, but look at what China's doing to try to counter the stealth and air superiority that we have. We also have space-based capabilities that we continue to build. We have, I think, the most robust private investment in space, both in constellations and in launch platforms of anybody in the world. I mean, those things are advantages to us, but make no mistake about what China's doing to try to catch up. If you look at what we do in the defense innovation space and the now private capital that's flowing there, I mean, that's pretty exciting to look at these small startups that are now, scaling, folks like Anduril and Palantir, and look at the number of private dollars that are sitting on the sidelines. All those things, I think, are advantages. We talked about the challenges. Our industrial base, our defense industrial base is not where it needs to be, not just from the production standpoint, but also the maintenance side. We have to do a better job of sustainment, taking care of the things that we have. We want to make sure, too, that we are focusing on expendable and attritable platforms, the things that allow us to scale quickly and that are affordable, and that we have a built-in advantage in how we're able to operationalize those platforms. Pretty incredible, the things that we can do. The key is we demonstrate these things on the small scale. Now the thing is how do we field not hundreds of those platforms, but thousands of those platforms? That really is going to be the game changer here, I think, in the short term. Again, we talk about logistics. I mean, this is a race where we have to be able to sustain what we do. So logistics, across the Pacific are going to be key. We have to make sure that we have that capability there. China's also looking to expand its presence outside the first island chain. So for them, logistics is going to be a challenge too. The key is how do we make sure we have all of those pieces of the puzzle together. Protecting the assets that we have out there, that's going to be key. We will never, ever again operate in an uncontested environment. I mean, that's what we have to deal with. So we have to change the mindset of how we do that. We have to also look at advancing our cyber capabilities. We know, as I said earlier, what China's going to do. There's millions of cyber attacks on this nation every day, not just on the Department of Defense, but all of our private systems, our infrastructure. We know there's malware that Chinese have placed there to hold our systems at risk. So if there is an effort by China to retake Taiwan, What will they do? They'll call up President Trump and say, by the way, we have this malware, and if you dare try to protect Taiwan, guess what? We'll turn the malware on. And all of a sudden, critical infrastructure systems, power grid, and those things are affected by that. So listen, China's pretty nefarious in the things that they have out there to do. Make no mistake about it. Our mindset years ago when we looked at China and said, oh, they're a benign influence. They're going to play by the rules of the rest of the world. They're not. They're not. They are a malevolent force out there that seeks to have China dominate the world. Anything that they do is transactional. It's all about what's to the advantage of China. So we see that what we have to do is to counter that, and we have to strengthen our relationship with our friends. We have our strengths, but we also have our challenges, and especially in that asymmetric realm, there are things that we can bring to bear that quickly balance or level the playing field.
Thank you. Congressman, you mentioned earlier the importance of innovation for U.S.-China competition. I've noticed in your efforts in Congress that you very much push for using AI to modernize our military.
Yes.
And of course, there's been lots of news recently about China's progress in AI, particularly DeepSeek. So I wanted to have you weigh in on this. What more do you think we need to do, particularly in the military space, with respect to AI?
Well, listen, I think we're doing an incredible job in AI. I think we still lead the realm in AI. What we need to do, though, is to make sure that we are turning up the effort by an order of magnitude. So it's not just AI, but it's also data. I mean, data is the foundation for AI. China understands this. That's why China wants to get its hardware in every place around the world. They want to be the vacuum cleaner for data. Listen, the United States is still the largest creator of data. The challenge is for us is how do we do a better job in using it? How do we do a better job of annotating the data to put it in useful form? That's the enabler for AI. And a lot of attention has been placed on DeepSeek. Listen, DeepSeek, has done some interesting things there in AI, but what they've also done is to shortcut. Typical Chinese behavior. Let's shortcut things and try to find a faster way there. In some realms that works, but in other realms it doesn't. So if you're not going to validate your AI modeling to determine if it's going to be actually accurate, and you shortcut that, I would argue maybe you get some short-term returns on that, but in the long term, the validity of that model is not going to be tried and true. Should we look at ways that we can shorten the validation process, shorten how you do things like digital twin? Absolutely. I think there are things that we can do within that realm, but I want to make sure too that we understand that there is a quality issue here with AI that matters, and you have to be able to trust AI. And if you try to shortcut things, the problem is you may not initially see that, but I guarantee in the long term you'll see some of the shortcomings that happen if you shortcut the validation process. So what it should do to us is it should inspire us to work even faster to do those things. And remember, AI is also not just data-based, and we have to do even more on the data side. And the challenge for the United States is how do we make sure as we're building these data centers, how do we make sure we have the power to run these data centers? And that means for us making sure we're very aggressive about the use of nuclear power. You're not going to power these things. And you see the major companies, Google and Microsoft, they're looking at that. They're not putting solar panels in anymore. What are they looking at? Small modular reactors. We want to make sure we're using power generation sources. So we have to look ahead of that. Again, we have to have a longer viewpoint on things like supply chain. So, we talk about building semiconductor plants. That's great. But when China owns 100% of the world's source of gallium, 98% of the world's source of germanium, and says, we're not going to sell it to you, I don't care how many semiconductor plants we build. If we don't have mines in the United States that can mine and refine, extract and refine and smelt rare earth and critical minerals, guess what? We're again going to be at the mercy of China. So we have to look longer term in the supply chain and do those things. Those things, I think, are incredibly important for the United States. And listen, in the words of the immortal Jerry Reed, we have a long ways to go in a short time to get there. I'm confident that we can do that. There are built-in advantages that we have in our system of government that if we utilize them fully, we can make sure that we are able to compete with China. Again, this is really about deterring China. Nobody wants a conflict. As much as we understand how China operates, we don't want a conflict, and I think the best way for us to deter a conflict is to make sure we have strength both economically and strategically. Those are the most important factors to deter China from thinking about entering into a conflict.
Congressman, you mentioned the importance of supply chains and critical minerals, and that brings me to another area that you spent a lot of time on, which is pushing through efforts through Congress on securing critical minerals.
Yes.
Could you share with us some of your recent efforts and where you see that line of work heading, particularly in the Trump administration?
Sure. Well, I think we have to get back into the mining business, and that means making sure that we actually permit extraction opportunities, permit refining opportunities, permit smelting opportunities here in the United States. Listen, we have some businesses that are operating in that realm. We have a company called MP Materials that mines rare earth. The problem is that when China dumps rare earth on the market and they can't produce because of unfair trade practices, and the actual cost or the sales price of their materials is below their production cost, it makes it very difficult. If you look at what China's done in dumping graphite on the market to try to put out of business companies that want to get in the graphite mining business. You know, we have to understand that there are unfair trade practices that China will put into place. I mean, they want to dominate the supply chain. You look at the memo going back to July of last year where they said, first of all, we're not going to sell particular rare earth to countries unless they do what we want them to do. They ban the export of technology on producing rare earth magnets, on producing rare earth high temperature sensors. It began last July. We heard about the most recent one, but it began last July. And they've incrementally ramped up and said, we're not going to sell these things. And that makes a difference when you own the predominant world source. I mean, China owns 16 of the 18 mines in Africa. And, you know, here we are looking at saying, well, we're going to do all these great things here in our industrial base. And yet when you buy materials there from those mines, you're actually enabling what China does. You're actually enabling the use of forced labor. You're actually enabling what China does in destroying environments in those mining operations. So we need to be mindful of that and understand that the way that we counter that is not just with talking about tariffs. Tariffs are a short-term way to do that, but you also need to make sure you build manufacturing capacity here. You know, I have several pieces of legislation in that are going to be much more aggressive in partnering with other nations, much more aggressive in defining our resources here, which are expansive. And then I want to make sure, too, that we're able to create a resilient reserve. And that is, we need to be creating our own markets where we define collective demand, and then our producers here can then produce to that collective demand. And then we cut China out of it with, say, China, well, listen, that's fine if you don't want to sell us minerals. We're actually going to produce our own. We're going to refine our own and sell our own and make sure that we have that guaranteed sourcing of critical minerals and rare earth elements for our national needs. And I argue that you can then expand that and make that marketplace a place where our friends and allies. You look at the Quad Agreement. What a great opportunity in the Quad Agreement, and for that matter, AUKUS Pillar 2, to do more in that realm to make sure that we're looking further down the supply chain than just producing things in the industrial base for our strategic needs, making sure we're doing things that create an economic opportunity for all those countries. I think that's a great potential there, and I look forward. I had some great conversations the other day with folks in the Indian government that are very, very interested in that, especially as they feel more and more isolated by the Belt Road Initiative around India by China.
So, Congressman, I'm cognizant of your time, so I want to ask two more questions related to conference topics.
Yes.
So one of the topics that we will be debating later is the axis, right? China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. And you mentioned some of your views earlier. One of the discussions we had yesterday in a track two, just U.S.-China, was the extent to which China actually has strong relations with all of these different actors, or the extent to which these actors are more problematic than China. What is your view on China's relationship with these three actors, and how do you view the relations, the bilateral relations with each of these?
Well, listen, you know, China's looking to develop these relationships because they see the relationships the United States has. Now, I argue we need to do more in creating stronger relationships with the United States. The things like the Quad and other efforts need to continue. You know, a lot of attention on the Trans-Pacific Partnership and what didn't happen with that. I think there's a lot of interest in bilateral relationships. We need to do more in strengthening relationships with our friends around the world. We understand that's going to be the key. We should be concerned about China's growing relationships with countries like Russia. Listen, I still think the trust is not quite there between Russia and China, but I believe that they will do things with each other that are mutually beneficial. And the same with North Korea and the same with Iran. I mean, they are going to look at this and say, what can we do that are to the advantage of China? I think, too, that it'll be interesting to see how those relationships grow. Will they be transactional? Will they be one-way relationships? Will they be, coercive sorts of relationships? I mean, you look at what Russia is doing with North Korea. Russia says, yeah, we're going to work with you. We'll give you some technology on autonomous systems, but you have to send troops to help us in Ukraine. So again, it's transactional. It's not, we're going to help you out of the goodness of our heart. It's, no, we're going to get something in return for that. You look at the discussions that have taken place between China and Russia, and the same thing. It's like, we'll do things, but there's always a balance sheet there. There's always a balance sheet, and both sides are always trying to figure out, do we gain or do we lose in this? So I always argue there's not a zero-sum game in this for China or Russia. So they're always going to, I think, kind of test each other, whereas the United States, I think, views these things a little bit differently. Now, there's obviously going to be a big debate about what we do in U.S. aid to foreign governments, which there should be. I mean, there should be. You look at that, Secretary of State Rubio and others are going to look very deeply at what those relationships would be and what do we do in ways that are directly helpful to those governments and how we can do those things in ways that are mutually beneficial. You know, our relationships with other countries have always been, let's look at what's mutually beneficial. It hasn't always been that way. I can tell you when I've traveled to places around the world, there are times when people look at it and go, you know, why are you all doing this? This just doesn't make sense for either the country involved or for the United States. So we have to do a better job in how we operate within that space, but also understand that China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are going to continue to pursue deeper relationships. They will do things that they see as mutually beneficial. Now, I would argue maybe in the long run, not so, but they're still going to pursue those things, and we need to be mindful of that.
It seems like what you're saying is of these four actors, they're problematic, but they're much weaker, as you said, in U.S. alliances and partnerships. So in a sense, they are threatening, but not to the extent that we may make of it as of right now.
I agree. And what we have to do is we have to do more to create deeper economic relationships. And again, that's how you get to deeper strategic relationships. It can't start strategically. It has to start at what can we do to help these countries economically? What can we do to share some technology? What can we do to help their economies grow? I mean, there's a lot of great opportunities there for the United States. We need to do more in that realm.
So I think I need to let you go in 2 minutes
Sure,
per your team.
We'll do one more question.
Last question I have for you is looking at the longer term trajectories, both U.S. growth as well as China's growth, and maybe we can focus on the military side, which I think you're probably much more focused on given your Armed Services Committee work. As you look at 2030, where do you see sort of the balance of power between the United States and China? Are you confident that we will either be more powerful than China or at least on par with China?
Listen, I think we're starting to make the right moves. The challenge for us is the Pentagon's a massively giant organization. The Pentagon still operates like the Ford Motor Company of the 1950s. Seriously, it's all hardware. You know, hardware, exquisite systems. Let's write requirements taking years. Let's do programs of record that take years. And then here we are, F-35, our 5th generation aircraft is now in year 23, and we've just gotten to full rate production. That can't happen anymore. We have to change how the Pentagon operates. The Pentagon has to go from being the Ford Motor Company of the 1950s to the Apple computer of 2025. We're seeing a little bit of that. We're seeing some emerging companies that are doing some really exciting work that can scale, that can get technology quickly in the hands of the warfighter. We have to make sure that we change how the Pentagon operates quickly. Again, it's a giant organization. We have to make sure, too, that we're pushing more resources forward closer to where they can be operationalized. So we look at money that goes through the Office of Secretary of Defense and then to the service branches. I would argue we need to look at more resources going to the combatant commands. They see the threat as it morphs every day. They see what they need to counter those threats. We also have to make sure, too, that there's more performance-related criteria in the National Defense Authorization Act. How do we make sure that when we authorize dollars, that those dollars are used in exactly the way that we prescribe? And if they're not, then what we should be willing to do is to say, when the agency comes back to us and says, no, we want to reprogram those dollars, we want to put them somewhere else, we go, no, sorry, we're not going to do that. You're not going to reprogram those dollars. You're going to use those for the intended purposes, and if you don't, we'll move the money somewhere else. And we have to make sure, too, the programs that have been successful in creating innovation, things like the Defense Innovation Unit and leveraging private capital like the Office of Strategic Capital, we have to do more to resource those elements in the Department of Defense. Defense Innovation Unit does great work, but it gets $1 billion out of $830 billion. Do you think we're going to be able to scale innovation and creation through that level of commitment? No. So we have to make sure we're scaling up those things. We have to reinforce the positive behavior. We have to make sure that that the Department of Defense transitions from that hardware-centric organization to a software-centric organization. Look at the world we live in today. The world we live in today is a software-informed world. And you look at the Pentagon's always been used to saying, we're going to build exquisite systems, they're going to take years writing requirements. And you look at today, they don't even know how to acquire software. They want to go into software acquisition and say, it's a cost-plus environment. You're like, no, software companies don't operate cost-plus because their product is always changing. They're not going to go back to the Pentagon every 3 months and go, we need a change order because our software has changed. It should be fixed price. And they have to change the mindset there. And again, it's because many folks in the Pentagon, not all, but many folks in the Pentagon are intimidated by software because they don't understand it. They don't understand coding. They don't understand how software works. They understand how steel gets welded together to build a ship, but they don't understand how software actually will enable that ship to do the things that the steel just doesn't enable it to do. So there has to be a change in mindset there. I think we're able to do that. The key is this. The Pentagon is a tremendously large organization. Large organizations themselves are never prone to change quickly. And that's not unique to the Pentagon. It's inherent in every large organization. So the question is how do we get the Pentagon to change quickly? And how do we make sure, too, that Congress is the forcing mechanism? If you look at it, Congress has always been the forcing mechanism in the past. If you look at it, how did the original unmanned aerial vehicles get put into place? It wasn't the Pentagon saying, oh, guess what? We're gonna build unmanned aerial vehicles. It was Congress. Congress saying, you're going to build them. And by the way, if you don't use the money to build them, we'll put the money somewhere else. Look at what happened in Afghanistan when we had the scourge of IEDs maiming and killing our service members. And we said, listen, Humvees aren't doing it. What do? The Pentagon says, well, we're going to study it. We said, no, we're not. We're actually going to build, these up-armored vehicles that can withstand these IEDs. And we directed the Pentagon to do that, and we did multi-acquisition. So we did multilateral acquisition. So we said, folks out there, send us your proposals. Let's take a look at all of them. And instead of saying we're going to down select to one, we said we need a lot of these vehicles very quickly. So we did multiple contract awards. So we had multiple vehicles built, and guess what? We had almost an overnight capability. We went from 0 to 1,000 of these vehicles literally overnight. Those are the things that we need to do. Our special operators do this all the time. They see a need, they write a request for proposals, they get those back in, and guess what? They go directly to acquisition. So you have programs like AFFIT, which gets money directly to these innovative projects. The Radar program, those things should be the rule, not the exception. We have all these exceptions where we can do things, one-time authorizations, mid-tier authorizations, and we create all these specialties instead of going, well, why don't we do it the reverse? Why don't we make sure that the standard acquisition process in the Pentagon allows for these innovative and creative ways instead of saying, nope, that's a great idea, but we don't have a requirement for that. Until I have a requirement, we can't acquire that. So we have to change the whole mindset, and we have to make what are today these little bastions of innovation and creation and really innovative acquisition processes. Why are they the exceptions? They need to be the rule in the Pentagon.
Well, thank you, Congress. I think you play not only an important role in enforcing change in the Pentagon, but also potentially accelerating some of the change that we need, as you mentioned, in U.S.-China competition.
Yeah, listen, I think the glass is half full. I think there's great opportunities there for the United States to be able to do the things that are in the interest, not just the United States, but in interest of the world in general. And I want to emphasize, the United States does not want conflict with anybody. But we understand, too, that during the course of human history, during the course of humankind, when there have been great imbalances of power is when we've had conflict. When we have great powers out there that are pretty equal, guess what? We live in a very peaceful world. So that's what the United States desires. I desire to make sure we have a close balance of power out there to where there's not an incentive for the United States, for China, for Russia, for North Korea, or Iran to seek conflict. That's really our intent here. And our intent, too, is to make sure that we all operate under what should be a common accepted practice. We all operate under the rule of law. We all operate with a basic understanding of protecting human beings, of protecting their dignity, of protecting what's given to us by our Creator, protecting the resources that allow all of us as human beings to sustain ourselves. Those things should be something we all have in common. So the question is how do we use what we have to get to that common ground? Again, I'm very positive about it. I'm very, very vocal and very direct in calling it out for what it is. But I want to be positive about this. And I really believe that we do have the opportunity to really create that balance to where we don't find ourselves, on the precipice of what we saw starting to unfold in 1938.
Thank you. I think that's an optimistic note to leave on. And also, I think hopefully our conference can help contribute to this by shedding more light on China's capabilities, but also what the United States should do more on.
Exactly.
So, Congressman, thank you so much for joining us.
Bonnie, thank you.
I would ask folks to stay in your seat while the Congressman leaves because he has a very tight schedule. So let's give the Congressman a round of applause.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to take a 10-minute break. I think we're going to be slightly delayed, but we will start again at 10:15. Thank you. Okay, folks, I know we're still waiting to get everyone seated, but we're going to start since we're already running a little bit late. So really grateful for you staying with us after the keynote fireside chat. And I think Representative Whitman really helped set the stage to understand where the Trump administration, but also where Congress is vis-a-vis China. So I think that leaves us a lot of room and space to debate, spend the rest of the day considering and debating some of the issues that the congressman talked about. So I'm delighted to have our first panel, our first debate. And for this one, we're debating the proposition, U.S.-China relations will maintain a fundamentally similar trajectory under the Trump administration as under the Biden administration. I think some might argue it's a bit early to debate this specific proposition, but I think it's really important for us, at least in the very beginning, to gauge what our initial perceptions on both sides of how U.S.-China relations may change in the next 4 or so years. I also think that as we're about 1 month or slightly less than 1 month into the second Trump administration, we already have quite a bit of evidence on how the Trump team may think about U.S.-China policy. We obviously have a wealth of information from President Trump's presidential campaign. We also have good information on how the senior folks that he have appointed to lead the respective organizations and their views on China. And of course, we also have a couple of weeks of information on how the Trump administration has taken action, particularly vis-a-vis China. Some might even argue that the current Trump administration's policies could be a continuity of the first Trump administration's policies, and that the Biden team, which came in between, actually continued quite a bit of the first Trump administration's policies. So I think there's much to debate on the U.S. side. I would also note that there is quite a bit of room to debate this on the Chinese side, because again, U.S.-China relations is not just determined by what's happening in Washington, but also China has a role too. So it would be interesting to also hear from our two leading experts here on whether China's policies might change, or whether, regardless of who is president or not, China will largely maintain similar policies vis-a-vis the United States. So with that, let me introduce the two distinguished experts. Immediately to my left is Dr. Da Wei. He is the director of the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University and a professor in the Department of International Relations at Tsinghua. His research and expertise encompasses China-U.S. relations and U.S. security and foreign policy. I'm not going to spend time reading through his entire detailed bio, but I'll just note that he spent around 3 decades examining this issue and is a critical interlocutor when it comes to engaging China. And he will be arguing against this proposition. Arguing against Da Wei is Mr. Rick Waters. He is and to the leftmost, he is the managing director of Eurasia Group's China practice. And drawing on his decades of experience in the U.S. Foreign Service, Rick leads the firm's China expertise and client offerings. And his research interests include China's global and regional diplomacy, U.S.-China relations, and China's domestic political economy. But Rick is probably most known for his 27-year career as the U.S. State Department's top China policy official. And he oversaw the creation of the Office of China Coordination, also informally known as China House. So with that, before we debate, next slide please, I would like to get a poll from the audience on your views of this. And we'll again come back to this poll after your debate to see if any of your views were changed by the arguments presented by either side. So let me turn the floor to Truly to explain to you how we're going to do this poll.
So you can either vote through the URL code on the left-hand side or by scanning the QR code on the right-hand side. If anybody has any issues, just raise your hand. I'm happy to come by.
Right, and you're voting if you agree or disagree with this proposition. So we'll give folks a minute, and I see some hands. So if you have a question, Truly will walk around to you. And for those of you online, you're also welcome to contribute to this poll either through the URL or through the QR code. Okay, I'll just give 30 more seconds for our online participants. Okay, I think the numbers are about stabilizing, almost close to 50-50, 53, or I guess still going up? Oh, no, maybe we have no, never mind. Slightly over 50 agree and slightly less than 50 disagree. So it's going to be a tough debate. I think we had some internal discussion, maybe it wouldn't be such a tough debate, but it seems like it might be equally matched. So for this debate, the format will be each speaker will offer 10 minutes of opening remarks, followed by 5 minutes of rebuttal, and then we'll go to Q&A. And at the very end, we'll come back to this poll again to see if any of their arguments were effective or not effective. So with that, Dawei, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Bonnie. First of all, I want to thank CSIS for having me here, and also want to thank all the audience coming to this debate before winter snowstorm this afternoon. So it seems that we all have deeper concern about China-U.S. relations than the snowstorm. The storm in China-U.S. relations is no. Okay, so yeah, this is a very interesting topic. I think if we, I was assigned to against it, but I will say if we look at the bilateral relations from the outer space, you will say, well, basically the same. Everything is the same. So no matter it's Republican or Democrats, Biden administration, Trump administration, because the basic structure of China-U.S. relations is always there. So it's changed very slowly. But since we are all sitting not in the outer space, we are all sitting in the CSIS conference room. I think from this town, from Beijing, from our desk, I will say, each administration are very different. Even within one administration, maybe each year could be very different. So I think the policy or the status of the China-U.S. relations in next 4 years will be very much different from that of the Biden administration the past 4 years for 3 reasons. The first is the whole international environment has changed. I think the victory of the second term of the President Trump already showed a very clear signal to the whole world, I will say. This is the end of the US-led liberal international order in which US provided economic and also security public goods to the whole world. I think this period has already ended. The whole world is moving towards economically more nationalistic and political and the security side more multipolar direction. I think within that context, China-US relations could not be the same as 4 years ago or 8 years ago. So the whole world are watching the changes in this town and also watching the potential reaction from China. I think the US alliance partners and other countries, in January, I spent 20 days in Singapore talking to my friends, partners in Southeast Asian countries. I think they all view China-US relations in a new, very different context. So this is the first reason. The second reason, I think, is the US is, of course, with the new administration, new president, I think is different. So comparing with Biden administration, I think the approach of Biden administration dealing with China, its China policy, basically is competition plus management, or try to achieve a manageable competition. But for this administration, I think it's basically, the previous one was competition plus management. For this administration, I think deal all confrontation. So I think this is a paradigm shift. It's different. It's very different. So now it seems that the bilateral relations is moving towards a direction of a deal. Of course, we don't know. But still, it's not so pessimistic as many people, including I myself, before or after the election. I think the general direction is, generally speaking, I think it's okay. But we could face different scenarios in the future. The first scenario could be we have a deal, then we have a relatively stable bilateral relations. But we could have other scenarios like we have a deal, but the implementation will be very difficult. Of course, another possibility is we don't have a deal. If we fail to achieve any deal, then we will see more confrontational situation. So anyway, different scenarios will be very volatile, I will say, from the U.S. perspective. And my third point and last point is China is different from past 4 years. I will say basically. China, when we view China-U.S. relations and the potential second Trump administration's policy to China, we have become more peaceful, restrained, and confident for several points. One is China, we all know that China is facing its economic headwinds at home. So basically, we believe this is caused mainly by our own policy rather than the U.S. Policy to China. U.S. play a minor role, but China itself, I think, play a major role. So I think China wants to focus on its economic development and improvement in next 4 years. So we'll more or less inward looking. Secondly, I think we are watching the changes in the U.S. Very closely. This is not what is happening now is not something, just happened overnight. Actually, it's a continuous tendency in past 8 years, I will say. The U.S. is moving away from globalization, and also the populist sentiment is strong here. And also many people want a revolution here domestically, I think. So those are big trends. I mean, international economic relations are changing, and also the U.S. domestic politics are changing. China is not the unique goal. China's in that picture. It's part of that, but China is not the goal. The goal is the United States. And also China become more confident about its own resilience of its economy, its supply chain, and its innovative capability. So I think basic attitude in Beijing is if this administration want to strike a deal with China, China will be very willing to do that. If this administration tends to adopt a more confrontational approach, China may try to avoid a tit-for-tat approach rather than turning away to the rest of the world and try to maintain or improve our relations with Europe, with Middle East, with ASEAN country, and with others. So, but of course, I cannot exclude the possibility that Beijing may be angered by something happened here. I think Rick told me many scaring scenarios which could anger Beijing. Yeah, I agree with him. I won't exclude that possibility, though I don't think it's very likely, but it's possible. So with that, I will end here. So in sum, I think the whole international environment changed. China changed, the U.S. changed, so China-U.S. relations will change. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Dawei. I will note that Dawei's remarks of his characterization of the environment, U.S. differences, I think is quite stark from the representative's view. So I think it's important for me to point out some of these differences as we continue throughout the day. And I'm sure we'll delve even deeper into some of this during Q&A, but also we might see some contrast in what Rick says. So Rick, over to you.
Thanks, Bonnie, and thanks to Truly for pulling all this together. We really appreciate what you guys do here. I will note before I begin, technically I think the initial poll was a statistical tie, so that means I win either way? Maybe? No, okay. Look, I think I volunteered to argue this side of the debate, and not initially because I was sure I agreed with it, but I wanted to interrogate the proposition, having lived as a nonpartisan civil servant in the bureaucracy under both President Trump's first term and under President Biden's recent term. And the starting point for what I want to talk about is a hypothesis that the real inflection point in U.S.-China relations happened sometime around 2017. And therefore, Biden's China strategy was really at a strategic level just an extension of President Trump's first term. And I think if we agree on that history, I think that is about as much as we can predict with confidence at this early stage of a second Trump term, that we passed an historic inflection point in terms of the U.S.-China strategy. Now, I will come back to talk about how the tactics are very different, but I think it is that difference between strategy and tactics that really matters here, because the more I kind of thought about this question myself, the more I realized that sometimes perhaps we inflate the significance of tactics. Yes, sometimes they can have in the aggregate strategic consequence. But let's look back for just a second and remind ourselves about the way in which the U.S. talked about China in its foundational documents, the National Security and Defense Strategy. I know some in this room were involved in preparing these documents. In 2010, we were still talking about increased engagement with China and Russia. In 2015, and this is the period that, there's a Chinese expression for having one foot in two separate canoes. You're not quite sure which side of the debate you're on. This is the Jiaota Liangzhichuan period of U.S.-China policy. 2015, we welcome the rise of a stable, peaceful, and prosperous China, but at the same time, the ever-present streak of managed competition comes more to the fore. So by 2015, the NSS, at the end of the Obama period, you're already starting to see the shift in emphasis. And I think it becomes most striking when you look at the series of documents that came out early in President Trump's tenure. 2017, you have the National Security Strategy flatly calling China a country that is trying to shape a world antithetical to U.S. views, trying to displace the U.S. in the Indo-Pacific. Again, these are not new concerns, but they have now taken on a dominant prioritization in U.S. national security thinking. The 2018 Section 301 findings, which again, they look at the economic and technology area of the relationship, and I won't go into all the details of that. 2018, the National Defense Strategy, China is a strategic competitor, full stop. The Biden administration strategically, I think, locked in and built on much of that thinking. So the 2022 National Security Strategy, that was Biden's document. Yes, it talked about handling the issue in a different way tactically, but the foundational premise strategically was that we were entering a decisive decade in which the terms of our competition with China would be set. The 2023 NDS, the National Defense Strategy, looks at China as the pacing challenge. So again, I don't want to belabor the history too much, except to say that strategically, the inflection point was between 2015 and 2017. And I think that played out in ways that sometimes we don't fully credit in terms of continuity, because we do tend to focus more on tactics, more on tweets. But if you look at it even at a level of domain-specific actions, in the area of the global order, yes, there are many differences tactically between President Trump and President Biden, but the initiative to strategically approach elections in the UN system began under President Trump. The use of the rulemaking process as an instrument of strategic competition really was started under President Trump and then developed very quickly under President Biden. So in the tech space, you have tactics that are continuous. In the bilateral realm, I know it's a bit of a stretch, but I actually think in some ways, both presidents are managing, even at a tactical level, some aspects of the relationship in a similar way by looking at the importance of leader-level diplomacy as a guardrail, whether we call it a deal, a guardrail, or what have you, to buffer and reduce the volatility of strategic competition they're pursuing in many domains. So I think there are really more similarities than differences. But I will end, and I think this is really where we should focus a lot of the discussion, Bonnie, on a little bit of a moment of honest reflection here about entering into the second term. There are many questions that I would leave open that could change these conclusions over the next 3.5 years. And to me, among those questions are, one, when you look at the tactics, for Biden, it was invest in industrial policy. For the Trump administration, it's going to be more deregulation, tax privileges. So there are tactical differences there. But when it comes to the rest of the world, what Biden called the alignment strategy, the effort to change China's cost calculus by building ad hoc coalitions, I think that is still very present in aspects of what we heard this morning from Representative Whitman or what we saw in the U.S.-Japan joint statement a few days ago. But the alignment is going to be tested by the effort to reset the global trading and economic system. And so I think we have to leave open a question of whether that test will have strategic effect. I don't have an answer there. I think we have to leave open the possibility that, as occurred in 2020 with the period of COVID and the breakdown in relations, when I think both sides became a bit more ideological, we have to leave open the possibility that a strategy of essentially managed competition could erode into unmanaged competition. And I think we also have to leave open the possibility that unresolved debates that lie beneath the so-called bipartisan consensus over U.S.-China policy, over pretty important questions such as the end state, or whether the U.S.'s sphere of influence does or does not include the first island chain. I would say that many in this room would have a very strong view on that, but these debates are playing out in articles that have come out very recently about whether the intention of the new administration is to focus primarily on the Western Hemisphere. And what does that mean for prioritization of East Asia or Africa outside of critical minerals and rare earths? So I just leave open those questions as things we should interrogate. But again, just to close off, I think the thesis that I'll put forward is the inflection point was 2017, and we shouldn't conflate the vast dissimilarity in tactics for a difference of strategic outlook. Thanks, Bonnie.
Great, thank you, Rick. And we can go back to some of these questions you raised in the Q&A. But I would like to turn the floor back to Dawei for any elaborations or any areas where you disagree with Rick on.
Yeah, thank you. And also want to thank Rick for wonderful. Oh. No. Yeah, it's on, right? Okay. Also want to thank Rick for you voluntarily choose the foresight. I think he believed that can give me a bigger chance to win. So for what Rick said, I want to say at least two things. One is, yeah, I agree that basic tendencies like that, strategy at the strategic level, it's similar. We can say that, just as I said at the beginning, the framework is always there. But tactic is really matters. So let's think about, look back to the history of past 8 years after 2017. After 2017, I think within the first Trump administration, the first year is different. 2017 is different from 2018 and 2019, right? 2017, President Xi was here and President Trump was in Beijing. I think they had a good time. But then 2018, we have trade war, we have other things. Then the first year is different from the second and the third year. Then the second and third year were different from the fourth year when we had COVID. I think the year of 2020 was the worst year in China-US relations in past 50 years, I will say. So it's different. And then if we look back to the 4 years of Biden administration, I will say the first 1 year and 2 years were difficult, but the third year and the fourth year were okay. Actually, Rick was in that process, played a very important role, and particularly the final year after the San Francisco summit, China-US relations stabilized. So then we have the chance to sitting here. I think we are all enjoying and benefiting from that process. So it's different. Even within one presidency, I will say it's different. No need to mention two different presidents. So tactics really matters. This representative just now mentioned 1938, really, was a shock for me. He mentioned that twice, that's World War II. But I will say, look back to the history of World War I. So assassination basically caused the major war into a world war. So nobody won that war, but we still had. So this is the first thing I want to say. The other is U.S. alliance, relations. I think I agree with Rick that it's under test, and not only in the trade relationship. So sometimes I feel sorry to say that. Sometimes when I talk to my friends here in the United States, I think many of my American friends don't know how the third party are talking about Americans when the Americans are absent. Of course, we as Chinese, we don't know how the other side talk about China when we were. So this is our blindness. But I mean, when I was in Singapore earlier last month, so when President Trump make the announcement after inauguration about Panama, about Greenland, so the Singaporeans and Southeastern country friends ask me, so, oh no, now Russia is taking Ukraine, US is taking Greenland, and mainland China may take Taiwan. So are you going to have a Yalta agreement like the end of the World War II? So, I mean, of course, you can say this is a joke, but I mean, there are some fundamental changes happening in the U.S. alliance relations. Even if this administration can handle it pretty well, I think the cleavage is already there. When they see this time, when they think about 80 years ago, when they think about the Iraq war during Bush administration, so I think the alliances cannot be tested once and for 3 times. I think it's too hard. So this will be very different from the Biden administration, and more similar to the first Trump administration. Yeah. Okay, I'll stop here.
Thank you. Rick?
Well, a couple of thoughts. I think Professor Da rightly points out that, 2020 was a bit of a unique year, and we can't rule out that those type of dynamics would return. But when I step back and look again at the arc that I was trying to paint, the last 8 years, if you were to graph U.S.-China relations, it goes like this. But it doesn't do so in a linear fashion. It kind of, weaves around the line. You have the 2017 state visit to China. Things are kind of on an upswing. And then tariffs, and then a tough period of testing each other in trade negotiations. And eventually you get to a phase 1 deal in 2020. So you're back on a little bit of a, plateau, and then COVID. And so I don't think we can really predict from the volatility what the trend is. I'm looking more at this trend, and that brings me to a second point. I think that the big difference that I think we're talking through right now is not so much about how the U.S. will manage China. We're talking about how the U.S. will manage competition around China. And Dawei and I were in Singapore actually at the same time, and the Singaporeans, they remind you politely that the U.S. and China are both strategic narcissists who think everything is about them. But I think what's also fair to say is that many of the changes that one perceives in the region that are being driven by U.S.-China competition are coming, I think, primarily from fears of China in the security realm, and sometimes in the influence realm, but opportunities that many countries see in the economic realm. And in the technology realm, it's becoming more contested. So, I think it's possible that, yes, the Biden administration was a little bit more think, and Republican administrations tend to be a bit more tank when it comes to how they handle the alliance relationships, whether it's a bit more muscle or a bit more consultation. But ultimately, I think from a strategic lens, I would be very surprised if in 4 years we would see anything other than further consolidation of the Quad and its diversification, which has already been occurring, into security realms such as maritime domain awareness. I think AUKUS will continue to develop, and it will become intertwined with the debates we heard about this morning over the urgent need to build out the defense industrial base in this country. I think the trilateral processes between the US, Japan, and Korea, and the US, Japan, and the Philippines, they have taken on a degree of institutionalization that will be hard to reverse, even given events in South Korea. So again, I think we're looking at the strategic direction. We're not looking at the volatility around the line. And it's very hard, in my view, to argue that the trajectory in many of these areas is going to go in a different direction.
Great, thank you, Rick. So I was making a short list of areas that the two of you disagree, and I have a short list of about 7. The first was on strategy versus tactics, and then related to that was volatility versus trend. I think there seems to be general agreement on the strategy versus tactics. On the strategy is similar, but the tactics different, but difference in terms of valuation of how important tactics are. The second, I think, that way you addressed this, but I didn't hear Rick, you talk about this. I would be interested in hearing now during the Q&A, your views on this. That way you said this is now the end of the US-led international order. And I didn't hear you, Rick, you address this. The third one was US allies and partners, how tested US allies and partners will be, and how much will this endure or continue to build. The fourth issue is, Dawi, you addressed this in your opening comment, is China different than before? Rick, you didn't touch on this, so I would love to hear if you think moving forward, China is different than, say, 4 years ago. Another thing that we talked about is how strategy could evolve, or how the approach could evolve, and both of you pointed to 2020 as a period where things could evolve. And then the last thing I'll point out is what, Rick, you mentioned in terms of unresolved debates in the Washington Consensus on China that could change the trajectory. And you particularly pointed out the unresolved debates on the end state that we want for China, as well as US-China relations, as well as the end state for US power. Particularly, does the US want a sphere of influence within the first island chain, or are we more focused on the Western hemisphere? So obviously, lots of different questions. I don't expect you to each address all of them, but I do want to at least offer each of you an opportunity to address what you think are most important of these issues, as well as any other issues that you want. Maybe, Rick, I could turn to you first, since Dawei spoke first.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start with the end of the U.S. order, the U.S.-led order. I think there's something to that argument depending on the domain you talk about. But I think the reality is, as you look across the globe at the conflicts that are raging in Ukraine, the instability in the Middle East, the common thread geopolitically is that the U.S. is still the indispensable actor. China's put forward a number of initiatives, GSI, GDI, et cetera, but when you look at the actual center of gravity of diplomacy, it is still President Trump and the key actors at the center of Ukraine. And I would argue in the Middle East context, it's the U.S.'s ally and partner Israel, but it's been in very clear coordination with the new administration even before they took office when it came to the Hamas prisoner exchange. So yes, the council is paralyzed. Many of the other groupings, including the G20, can barely get a statement out. But I think you really have to go by domain, and it might be that in the economic realm, the atomization of the global economic order is much closer to what Professor Da has described. We're not really building new architectures. We're back to bilateral concepts, and where new architectures are being built, in many cases, they're being built around the U.S., and I do think that's an area that we as Americans should be worried about.
And maybe, Rick, if I could ask you one other question. Do you think China has changed in the last 4 years, or do you think China is largely on the same trajectory as before?
That's a big question. Look, I will say with the the honest humility of, I've been there a few times since COVID, but you only scratch the surface. So I think I will approach this more from observations of Chinese behavior. And I think what is clear to me is that China is acting as if it is preoccupied with a difficult structural slowdown in the economy, the impact of the post-COVID closure period on sentiment. And I think that the evidence is probably the best way to think about this. You look at the ways in which China has moved to stabilize a number of relationships in its periphery with India, with Australia, with Japan. These are tactical stabilization efforts, and I think that was part of the dynamic that drove the San Francisco summit under the previous administration as well. But again, it is kind of a tactical pause. Remember the trajectory. We go through these plateaus. That's where we are right now. I think it would be kind of maybe hubris for me to offer more fundamental observations about what has changed. I think it is possible that something fundamental is shifting, but I think, Bonnie, we would have to look back with the benefit of history and a lot more data to really draw broader conclusions.
Great, thank you, Rick. Dawei, any comments on any of the areas?
Actually, on the U.S.-led order thing, I think the change is not about the gravity or about the importance, the strength of the U.S. Of course, U.S. is still the most powerful country in the world and the foreseeable future, but the change is lead. I don't think the U.S. want to lead now. I think the U.S. is changing from a more or less universalism into a nationalism approach. Do not want to provide public goods like open and free market, and also don't want to fight a war in somewhere, in the Middle East or in somewhere, far away from the U.S. I think this is the fundamental change, not only changes in the government. I mean, President Trump is just a syndrome of this fundamental change among the people. I think this is deeply rooted in this society, want to shift back from the universalism into nationalism. And maybe in the future, the U.S. will shift back, I don't know. But at least for next 4 years and maybe 8 years, I think U.S. Don't want to lead that. The U.S. may still lead some countries, but that's not a universal system like after the end of the Cold War. So I think that's a fundamental differences. And on the end states thing, I think it's, I wrote an article, try to summarize this debate. Rick was in that debate. Try to understand it. I have to say it's a very complicated picture. When I try to summarize it, I mean, there's no consensus here over the end state. And I think now President Trump adding more end states to this debate, so make everybody confused. So without, so he's providing new options, new possibilities, no matter for good or for bad. So with this, I also think probably, since there's no consensus about the end state, the next 4 years could be different from previous 4 years.
Thank you. And just a quick follow-up, what are the additional end states that President Trump is adding?
I think yesterday in our closed-door meeting, some people also mentioned this. I think you can hardly imagine a U.S. president other than President Trump say, if I can work with President Xi, we can solve all the problems internationally, globally. I think this is not an end state that any other politician in the U.S. can say. So this is one of the possibility. Yeah.
Well, that's a very optimistic end state of U.S.-China working together under President Trump. So with that, let me open up the floor to Q&A first from the room, and then we'll take a couple from the room, and then we'll go online. So please raise your hand if you have any questions. So I see 3 hands right here.
Thank you. Pavlo Zvonogorski, Georgetown University. I have a question about the trajectory of the economic side of the US-China future relations. And as we know, yesterday Chinese State Council had an executive meeting, and it concluded that China will try to remove foreign investment restrictions in manufacturing. It will broaden the scope of industries open for foreign investments. It will optimize the rules for foreign investments, mergers, and acquisitions. So my question is whether you think one of the calculations here might be to specifically target American businesses, especially those close to the current administration, in order to increase their dependence on the Chinese market and thus strengthen the leverage Beijing has over decision makers in Washington, while in this way changing the trajectory toward more cooperation in economy. Thank you.
Great, let's collect the other two questions first. And I would also say we do have an economic panel, so if we don't get to your question, we can address that during the economic, it was the one in front. But that's okay, you can go too.
Yes, I am from private sector. I would like to, this question is for Dr. Wee. And what is your current thinking, position, or whatever you want to say regarding the tariffs that the current administration has put on China? The tariffs.
So just tariffs, right?
Tariffs.
Okay, view on the tariffs, okay. One last one here.
Thank you. I have a question for Rick. You emphasized the strategic continuity between the two administrations. Then the Biden administration pay much attention to the so-called friend shoring to ensure the resilience or security of supply chains. So do you think will Trump administration continue this strategy?
Okay, thank you. We'll take your question next, in the next round. So over to Rick and Dawa, whoever wants to go first.
Okay, on the measures, I didn't follow the news, but on the measures that Chinese State Council to open up our manufacturing and other economic sector, I think basically China want to show a gesture, to the international community that China is open, and it's a continuous gesture. It's not something very new. So China do that step by step, gradually. But I don't think it's very much. I don't think it's very. It can change anything in terms of China-U.S. economic ties. I think the U.S. business in China they have a lot of concerns and dissatisfactions to China's overall business environment. And also, I think the biggest question. Actually, I think the biggest question is about the general direction of China's economy. Is that still, does Chinese government still committed to the market-oriented economic policy or reform? And also, it's also related to the capability of the U.S. business, U.S. company in the United States. In China, they are facing, very, very, intense competition from Chinese companies, particularly in the manufacturing sector. So I think China, of course, want to show this friendly opening up posture to the outside world, but I don't think it will have great impact on China-U.S. economic ties. And on tariff thing, of course, we oppose tariff, but I think we need to differentiate different tariffs. So currently, the 10% tariff is basically about the fentanyl issue. So I will say it's more or less, again, like yesterday we discussed, it's like a sanction. It's aimed at something, right? It's not about, it's not a change of the international economic relations. It's about one thing. It's a specific thing. That's a fentanyl issue. So I don't know how will this 10% tariff evolve next step, but I assume that the Trump administration may sooner or later have another round of tariff, I don't know, again, I don't know how 60% or, I don't know the level, but it's aimed at readjusting the trade system internationally. It's not only about China, not only about Canada, Mexico, it's a universal tax. So how China view that, of course, it's bad news, but it also depends on if it's a universal tax, a universal tariff, the impact on China will be lower. But if it's just to pick several countries, and China could have bigger impact. But again, I don't think China will have a tit-for-tat approach against this. We may, to be honest, I think our leverage is not, we don't have so many leverages. Of course, we may, just like this round of 10%, we already did several limited reaction to that. I think the approach will be similar. So it mainly depends on how the Trump administration choose their policy, their instrument. Yes.
Maybe Dawei, just for our audience who may not be that aware, what was the Chinese reaction to the tariffs? If you could elaborate.
Yeah, we selected a tariff on several, for example, LNG, coal. Actually, China only import very limited LNG and coal from the U.S. We also declared, we put the two U.S. companies on our entity list, and we have some restriction over the restrictive measures on the rare earth exportation. I think that's all. Anything else? Yeah, basically. Again, this is quite limited, I think. Yeah.
Rick?
I know Professor Tu can tell us if we missed anything on the retaliation, but that's right. Look, I'll just add two responses to various questions. First, to your question about friendshoring. Look, I don't represent the Trump administration. I've been out of government for 2 years now, but this is what I think they're trying to do. I think they're looking at a global trading and economic system that Americans perceive as fundamentally unfair. And so the goal is to reset that trading system and the strategy aims to reshore, not to friendshore. But there is a reality that there are certain things that will not come back to the U.S. And in those areas, low-wage manufacturing, things in which the U.S. just doesn't have comparative advantage, there is an interesting question of whether the USMCA bloc can be modernized in a way where low-wage manufacture happens in Mexico. But that can't happen if Mexico is also a beachhead for circumvention of the overall strategy. And that's where a lot of what I think is happening now is get USMCA right, and that is the necessary precondition to getting the global trading reset right. Now, we can debate whether these tactics are going to work, and we'll leave that to the afternoon panel. But I think to be fair, we have to look at what the theory is. And this brings me to end states. When I look at President Trump's inaugural address, what's striking to me is that it is primarily about these issues. The geopolitical elements are not that dominant. There's a focus on the Western Hemisphere. The only time that China comes up is in the context of the Panama Canal. And so I'm not going to go so far as to say that we should read firm conclusions from that. But I think what we can say is that, perhaps it will be the case that the U.S. becomes more of an offshore balancer focused on prioritizing. And this, to me, is something that has evolved since that inflection point I mentioned in 2017. Yes, the U.S. diagnosed that it was in a strategic competition, and that conclusion came more into the forefront. But from the perspective of what you do about it, there has been a lot of volatility and a lot of inability to prioritize regionally, sectorally, or in terms of finite political and financial capital. And I think that is the process that we're seeing today. The Western Hemisphere is clearly going to be the priority. What that means for East Asia, I doubt it's too fundamental of a shift, but we have to leave open the possibility that things evolve. And it probably means that the U.S. goes back to its historical role as more of an offshore balancer and less of a country that is inclined to wage ground wars in regions that are not as present in its national interest as they might have been 10 or 20 years ago.
Okay, great. I'm going to read one online question. It's actually a four-part question, and then we'll take three more questions from the room. So this four-part question is from Paul here, Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Does the Trump administration share the Biden administration's view of what China's global strategic ambitions are? Is that view accurate? Does Trump agree with his advisors on this issue? Might he sidestep it in pursuit of engagement with Xi Jinping? And then we'll take three more questions from the room. I think we had one there, one up here, and then one back there.
Morning. My name is Han. I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies here. So Dr. Da, if I heard you right, you said Rick told you that about some scary scenarios that what could happen in the next 4 years. So could you both elaborate on how the two countries view the so-called red lines of U.S.-China relations and how they could be tested in Trump 2? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Zhao Long from Shanghai Institute for International Studies. I have a question to Rick. You have reviewed the whole process of the changing perceptions of the U.S. towards China starting from 2015. But some argue that this kind of a formulation for perceptions during the Biden administration was significantly impacted by the U.S. allies and partners. For instance, the policy shift from decoupling to de-risking, which influenced by Europe. So in your opinion, for the new Trump administration, can the U.S. allies still play this kind of a role? Thank you.
It's good to have you here, Dr. Da. I'm Lalo from Johns Hopkins Csis. So my question is, in the recent years, China has shifted its primary focus from market economy reform to ensuring regime security, so which has also become a key concern for the U.S. side. So meanwhile, with the Trump administration reducing funds for certain relevant institutions and agencies, many organizations dedicated to China's human rights issues are experiencing significant financial constraints. So just a few days ago, Elon Musk even suggests shutting down the Voice of America. So how does China perceive this trend? And does it view this development as a contributing to a greater regime security in Beijing? Thank you.
And I think I saw one more question here if you want to get your question in. And I think that will be the last question from the audience.
Oh no, he's an unreliable entity.
Thank you, Rick. I appreciate the vote of confidence. Jim Mullinex, diplomatic fellow at the Wilson Center. You spoke quickly about the role of allies and the important position during the Biden administration of engagement with allies. Obviously, the Trump administration seems to be taking a very different approach in terms of being more confrontational on the economic side, reducing USAID, shutting down USAID essentially, and eliminating that channel for soft power. I'd be very curious to hear from Dr. Da, particularly your thoughts about whether or not China sees this as an opportunity to build alliances or to extend its relationships with countries around the world, and how they might do that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Lots of questions, all very easy questions. I'm expecting all of you to answer each question in 15 seconds. No, please have your choice of which questions you have time to answer, and defer to you on who wants to start.
On the red line things, I think Taiwan, of course, and also political security, criticizing our Chinese regime and the system and the political leader. I think those are the, and Rick told me other things, but I don't want to mention his scenario. For me, Taiwan and the political system, and the regime security, right? Vis-a-vis the latest movement of this administration. I think Chinese government basically feel we are quite secure domestically, I mean, I think, of course, people sometimes criticize government for policy, specific policy, economic policy, COVID policy, but generally speaking, I will say majority of Chinese people are very satisfied with the current system. So I don't see any, major threat to that. So I think the changes here in this town is mainly, I believe, will have impact on the U.S. relations with, for example, your other developing countries. I think those are the changes that we are watching, not about our own security, political security. And on alliance building, I don't think so, to be honest. I think theoretically it's an opportunity for China, but building alliances is not an easy thing. You need to provide security assurance. You need capability. You need similar ideology. You need something hard, and you need something soft, both attractive to the partners. I don't think China can provide either hard or soft part to build that. And also alliance building, it takes time and it takes lives. So I don't think so. So this is my answer to the questions. Yes.
All right, and I think on the question that Professor Tu posed about, it's the same basic topic. It's on alliances and partnerships. Look, I think it's clear the Trump administration is going to be much more willing to test the proposition of how much leverage it has in these relationships to achieve a number of goals. And I think the honest answer is we'll have to see. We'll have to see what happens with King Abdullah, who's here in Washington today. We'll have to see whether these tests of the application of leverage that go beyond some of past tactics play out. But I think it's just very hard to predict. And I think, I served in Pakistan for 2 years. We had a multi-billion-dollar assistance relationship. And what we found is that it actually gave us strikingly little leverage to move the Pakistanis on issues that they didn't see as in their national interest. So I think this test will be a fascinating one to watch.
Since we only had one online question, I will ask maybe if either or both of you might address it. So do you think the Trump administration shares the Biden administration's view of what China's global ambitions are? And does his team agree with it? And could he step at an engagement with Xi Jinping? Either of you in terms of your views.
I don't know what is the Biden administration or Trump administration's understanding of China's global ambition. I think they have different understanding, including the representative just now, he viewed China as the axis of evil, Nazi Germany. I don't know if that's President Trump's understanding of China's position. Probably not, because President Trump believes he can work with China, maybe. So I don't think FDR want to work with Hitler. So, right? So again, I don't think there's the consensus here. I'm sorry. Yeah, maybe you have better answer.
Look, I mean, it's month one. I mean, I think the honest answer is we have to give the new administration time to get people in chairs, to get, we will see speeches from Mike Waltz and others that give us answers to that question. We'll probably eventually see an updated NSS. But I do think what is clear is that the big shift has been the Ukraine war and the perception that, whether it's an axis or, as Tony Blinken, my old boss, used to put it, Russia, DPRK together with China, which drew a little bit of a distinction between their interests. Something is happening in that space that is consequential. And my guess is that will be reflected in the national security documents and speeches of the new administration when they've all been confirmed and when they've started giving those coordinated messages.
Okay, any final thoughts from either of you in terms of making your position before we go back to voting?
What was the vote again?
Vote for Rick.
So Rick, you are arguing for the proposition that that U.S.-China relations will maintain a fundamentally similar trajectory. So any thoughts by either of you before we go to voting, or happy to go directly to voting?
Yeah.
Well, look, I'll just add one final thought because you're teasing around it. What are the things that could change my view? I actually think it gets to the end state question, not because I think any administration really has to coalesce around or decide that issue, it's because at a certain level, what we saw in 2020, and that might have been the aberration we should dig down on here, is that there are certain things that can be perceived as the US going after the Chinese regime, even if that may not be the intent. And so I would allow that where I might be wrong is if trade tensions spill over into what I would call a period of just unmanaged decoupling, where issues that the Chinese side calls red lines, and I don't think the US will accept that verbatim or rotely, but I think we have to allow that if certain US actions are perceived as threatening the regime, the response function in China will change. And so I can't predict exactly where that moment is or how it looks tactically. But I think that would be the point at which I would allow that my side of the argument is wrong. I would just say that I don't think, based on what we've seen from the early weeks of the Trump administration, that should be our base case.
Great. With that, truly, can we pull up the poll? So please vote again. We'll give this a minute or two, and then we will compare. It's not showing up as bars. There we go. Huh. Rick, I think ending on how you might be wrong might not have been the most persuasive case.
That's all right. I won last.
I think a statistically significant change, Rick. well, I think we'll let it stabilize. It seems to be stabilizing. But in the meantime, I wanted to thank both Dawei and Rick for a fascinating discussion, and in many cases admitting where you're more certain or less certain, because I think we're entering, as you both mentioned, we're entering a pretty new period, and the Trump administration has yet to define how it may act. And of course, as Dawei, you mentioned, China's response will also be quite dependent on the U.S. policy. So thank you both again for joining us and for making this first debate contested and wonderful. So they both won. So we're going to take a 10-minute break. We will reconvene at 11:30.
Thank you, everyone. I think we'll get started in the interest of time as people keep coming in and sitting down. My name is Ilaria Mazzocco. I am a senior fellow and deputy director with the trustee chair in Chinese business and economics here at CSIS. And I have some very smart panelists who will be joining me today and debating a spicy topic. But before I do, I move on to introduce them and introduce the proposition. I just wanted to give everybody a reminder that this is a debate that's meant to spark, new thinking. So the format itself is meant to be provocative, but it is sort of an intellectual exercise. It does not represent the views of anybody, either in the room or even the panelists themselves were actually assigned the topic, and certainly not the views of CSIS. So just wanted to remind everybody that this is sort of a collegial debate. So the proposition is by 2030, China will have greater global influence than the United States. Of course, influence is something that can be interpreted in many different ways, but I think many of us, our minds go to alliances, military, and of course, soft power. So it's certainly something that many in Washington and Beijing, but also around the world, certainly think about. So I think with that, I'll let my colleague Truly explain the voting process for those in the room.
Okay, great. So the polling is now live. You can either go to the shortened QR code on the right-hand side or the shortened URL on the left-hand side. If anyone has any questions, feel free to just raise your hand and I'm happy to come around and help you out.
There's no question.
Looks like we're starting to get the results in. Before we get the final results, let me start with the bios of our panelists. I'm going to just read really shortened bios. I encourage everybody to go online and see the full bios. These are, very accomplished people. So I have Dr. Zhang Feng, Associate Research Scholar with the Council on East Asian Studies at the Macmillan Center for International Area Studies at Yale University, specializes in China's foreign policy, international relations policy, and author of many books. And then we have Dennis Wilder, who is Senior Fellow in the Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues and Assistant Professor of the Practice in Asian Studies in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. He has a long and distinguished career in government, including in the National Security Council and the CIA, and we're really pleased to have both of you today. So it looks like Zhang Feng, who will be arguing in favor of the proposition, is going to be, at a disadvantage here because the vast majority of those in the room seem to disagree with the proposition, which is what Dennis will be arguing for. Zhang Feng will start. You'll have 10 minutes, then Dennis will have 10 minutes, and then you'll have 5 minutes each for a rebuttal, and then we'll move to audience questions.
Great. First of all, I'd like to thank Bonnie and CSIS for inviting me to this debate. And I'm honored to share the stage with Dennis, who's had a very distinguished government and policy career. I'm arguing for the proposition that by 2030, China will have greater global influence than the United States. And I actually think this is a hard proposition to argue, as the audience poll has already indicated. But I think it's hard mainly because there's so many uncertainties down the road. But this is a debate, as Lara has reminded us. So I'll try to make my argument as compelling as possible. Unfortunately, arguing for the proposition has been made considerably easier by the return of President Trump. 2030 will be 1 year after the end of the second Trump administration, and I'll build my case around the core proposition that the second Trump administration will deliver the goal for China. Of course, China's own policies will still be very important, but the policy challenges will be made less acute by the Trump administration's policies that I think we can argue are likely to damage the US national interest. So as long as China doesn't make gratuitous mistakes, it's going to have greater global influence than the US. Let me begin with the domestic foundation of international influence. To have global influence, you first need to have a sufficient degree of material capabilities. Here, China still lags behind the US. In 2024, last year, China's GDP is about 64% of the US by market exchange rate. And the gap between their military power is larger. But the point of influence is that you only need to reach a certain threshold in material power. You do not need full parity. And what is influence? Influence is about winning hearts and minds. Influence the ability to get others to do things that they would otherwise not do, or to prevent them from doing things that they otherwise would. So influence is about how you effectively exercise your material power. So influence clearly rests on material power, but only in part. Once your power reaches a certain threshold, you'll need to rely on other tools of statecraft to achieve influence. And these tools can include coercion, inducement, and persuasion, and others. And I want to argue that coercion is a costly tool and is usually effective only in the short term. But this is the main instrument the Trump administration is apparently relying on now, and this is going to reduce the US global influence in the long term. Inducement, mainly economic inducements, economic benefits, and persuasion are more effective over the long run. Although China also employs coercion as a policy tool, but compared with the Trump administration, its use of inducement and persuasion is going to be far more notable. So I'd say that 64% of the US GDP gives China a solid material foundation to compete with the US for global influence. And the military balance is less relevant because the contest for influence is primarily non-military in character. And material power aside, there is a second critical source of global influence. That is the quality of your domestic institutions and governance. And here the US and China each has its own strengths and weaknesses. But I think what's happening now is that the second Trump administration is apparently amplifying US weaknesses. At the start of this administration, we are seeing deepening divisions within the US government and the US society as a whole. There's a new joke making the rounds, including during yesterday's track 2, that American-style cultural revolution is sweeping through Washington. So this is a serious threat to the strengths of US domestic institutions and the capacity of those institutions to foster innovation and drive economic growth. And added to this, as we know, is the polarization of American politics. So the resilience of American democracy is in doubt. We need to remember that America has long claimed to be a beacon of democracy for the world, perhaps no longer. So the damage that the administration will do to American democracy will be considerable, and it will considerably reduce the appeal of the American model in the world. Now let me turn to foreign policy. Judging from the first 3 weeks of the administration, President Trump seems to be indulging in a kind of 19th century style imperialism. He wants to redraw the map of the world. We already heard lots of examples of that. But we are no longer in the 19th century when the world was divided into a superior West and a backward West. We're in the 21st century. And in the 21st century, this kind of imperialism will end, I think, in overreach and exhaustion. It may well mean the end of Pax Americana. And more to the point of influence, America seems to become incredibly selfish on the global stage. There's little to no conception about helping other countries and peoples and making the world a better place. So if your policy is guided by extremely narrow self-interest, this will mean the forfeiting of global influence, because it will mean that you don't want to have anything to do with anything, global. So the upshot is that the second Trump administration is likely to undermine U.S. leadership and influence globally. And China doesn't need to do much. In other words, China doesn't need to have an active strategy of influence to compete with America. It seems that the Pax Americana will be undermined from within. And quickly, a couple of other points. The importance of allies and partners. We know America's greatest advantage over China is its global network of allies and partners, but then when you start bullying your partners, allies and partners, driving them away, not only will you lose influence, you perhaps also create tensions with them. And those tensions will consume your diplomatic resources. And this kind of behavior may lead to the collapse of Western unity and the convergence of interests among China and Western countries, especially those in Europe. My next point is about the economic and military foundations of influence. I want to argue that in the 21st century, unlike in the 19th, military power is often counterproductive to the goal of influence. This is because competition for influence takes place primarily in non-military domains, especially in the economic domain. And here, China's relative military weakness is a blessing, not a curse, and its economic advantage over the U.S. is going to grow larger given the Trump administration's trade policy. So the logical conclusion here is that U.S. military primacy will not give you global influence. There is no correlation between military power and global influence. You can boast your military capabilities in Asia, and this may be useful for other purposes, but it cannot substitute for strategy or influence. I'll stop here for now.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, Dennis, you have 10 minutes to respond. Okay. Or not respond, to give your initial statements. Yes, sorry.
First of all, thank you for CSIS doing this. I've been to several of these sessions over the years, and I think it's a terrific way to illuminate topics. Secondly, I'd like to say that Rick's failure in the last panel had nothing to do with his Georgetown education, but I am a little humiliated by how poorly he did. Perhaps I can do a little better. Obviously, global influence is not a monolithic concept. It involves multiple domains. So let me try and go through a few of those. First of all, the military. Geographically, the United States inescapably has an advantage over China. China has border disputes with half of its 14 neighbors, including India. Thus, China has to spend heavily on border defense. We are protected by 2 large oceans and until recently by 2 very friendly neighbors. So we have the luxury of force protection in a way or force projection in a way China doesn't. We have 11 carrier battle groups, 750 bases in 80 countries, 160,000 soldiers stationed in our allied and partners. Moreover, and I want to stress this, U.S. military power is not just about warfighting. It's also about humanitarian operations that are very influential around the world. I was involved in the Indonesian tsunami, and the best thing we could do was to send the Abe Lincoln Carrier Battle Group off of Indonesia. We saved tens of thousands of lives Because of American military power, we created an air bridge to Utapao base in Thailand, where we used to bomb Vietnam from. But American power militarily is much more than about just force. On the other hand, China has only 3 carriers. I wouldn't even call them carrier battle groups yet. They haven't ventured beyond the Western Pacific, and they have 1 small base in Djibouti. So I think it's safe to say in the military realm, China will not, in the next 5 years, challenge American influence. Secondly, there's been an awful lot of loose talk about the demise of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, and that it would somehow be replaced by the UN. It's true that the share of global central bank reserves held in US dollars has dropped from about 70% to 60% since 2000. But a study by HSBC Bank found China is not the beneficiary of this change. Rather, central banks are reducing dollar holdings and increasing holdings of more currencies from small economies with strong credit ratings, such as the Australian dollar, the Canadian dollar, and South Korean won. A report from JP Morgan, written last October, concluded that the real erosion of the dollar's dominance will not take place for decades because of America's deep and liquid capital markets, rule of law, predictable legal system, commitment to free-floating regime, and smooth functioning of the financial system for US dollar liquidity and institutional transparency. Another area where you hear that China is gaining influence is the fact that about the 70% of the world today, or 145 economies, now trade more with China than the United States. But let's look at the nature of that trade. As China's consumer demand has lagged, China's trade surplus with the world has more than doubled from $430 billion in 2019 to almost $1 trillion today. But as evident, global South countries are increasingly concerned about this because China is dumping excess capacity on their markets, stunting the growth of their own industries. By contrast, the US has a record $1.2 trillion trade deficit with the globe, as Mr. Trump constantly says. But this actually helps other economies. And in fact, the United States has not had a trade surplus since 1975. Another area I want to just quickly hit is the impact of BRI. We hear that BRI is increasing China's influence around the world. It's created more than 150, operates in 150 countries, 200 agreements. I would just point to some very interesting work that is being done by academics. Dr. Zenoba Chan, who is actually of Georgetown now, did an in-depth study of what she calls the inducement dilemma in economic tradecraft. And what she has concluded is that Beijing's dual goals behind the BRI of addressing overcapacity and gaining international acceptance undercut each other. Now, I won't go into the details of this. She will actually do a presentation at Georgetown on the 28th of February if you want to come. Another recent study by a Princeton scholar looked at US and Chinese development assistance in Indonesia. She found that the US aid led to a much more positive view of the United States than Chinese assistance. And she concluded that USAID was more attuned to the local environment and social impacts than Chinese projects. There were more protests against Chinese projects than US projects. Now I can see exactly what you're thinking at this moment. USAID is dead, right? I know. Okay. And as someone who helped implement at the White House the PEPFAR program, which saved 26 million lives around the world, I do share the concern about the future of US foreign assistance. But let's not get overhyped by the media and accept at face value that China is ready or able to step in where the U.S. may be leaving a vacuum. Even Donald Trump and the vaunted Elon Musk cannot alter these significant advantages that the United States has and will continue to enjoy. I think I've shown that global influence is a tapestry of hard and soft power in which the U.S. will prevail over the next 5 years and beyond. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Under 10 minutes, both of you. So I think you can take now 5 minutes each to respond. John Feng, if you want to give a response.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dennis. Very interesting. You started with the military domain, but I argued in my opening statement that the military domain is actually not so relevant to the competition for influence. But I can understand, perhaps inside the United States, the military domain is extremely important as a sphere of competition for influence. And this is, of course, convenient because I agree with you that the U.S. military power is still, strongest in the world and is stronger than China in military areas. But if you ask people in other parts of the world, especially the developing world, I'm thinking of, for example, you used the example of Indonesia, so we can perhaps use Southeast Asia as an example. When they think about U.S.-China competition for influence, they usually don't talk about the military domain. They talk about, I think their dominant frame of reference is the economic domain. What kind of economic development assistance that the U.S. and China can provide to the region. And here I think China's advantage is decisive. And I can mention the fact that ever since President Trump withdrew the U.S. from the TPP on his first day in office during his first term, the U.S. has lacked an effective economic strategy for the Indo-Pacific or for the Asian region. So here, I think China's advantage is large. And as I said, as long as I also agree with you that the U.S. military power is not just about war fighting, it's also about humanitarian assistance. So you can do lots of military diplomacy. But in the end, the military is a blunt instrument. That's the nature of military power. On trade, I think you made a very interesting but to me somewhat baffling argument because you said that China runs large trade surplus with a lot of countries in the world. This is all true. Last year, China's trade surplus reached over $1 trillion US dollars, and this, of course, created a problem of Chinese goods, large amounts of Chinese goods entering the markets, those countries, and naturally, many of these countries are getting concerned. But you seem to draw a correlation between trade surplus with loss of influence and trade deficit, which, as you pointed out again, the U.S. runs large trade deficits with many countries, and you seem to imply that this gives you influence. I don't quite see the logic. And if you combine that with the administration's policy, the current administration's policy, use tariff threats and sanctions, actually those trade deficits are a curse for U.S. influence because you're basically coercing, bullying countries that run trade surplus with you. So I would flip your argument in my favor. Finally, on the BRI, I think perhaps it was not so wise for you to use the USAID as an example because you immediately disapprove of it as a good example. But I think we need to, on the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative itself, we need to have a more balanced assessment of the BRI. I mean, in the scholarly community, both in the US and inside China, there is an accumulating body of research that is giving a more objective assessment of the strengths and weaknesses of many of those BRI projects. Sure, there are problems, but I think there are also, projects that have brought real development benefits to the TAR countries. Again, I would use examples in Southeast Asia, in the least developed countries in Southeast Asia, continental Southeast Asia countries like Laos, for example. Read news stories about the high-speed rail built between China and Laos. A lot of people in Laos, they genuinely appreciate the economic opportunity this kind of infrastructure developments will be able to bring to the country. So I would not consider BRI as a decisive argument against the rising Chinese influence.
Dennis?
There's no question that military power is a dual-edged sword. You have the hegemonic dangers of U.S. power, and certainly we have been accused by countries like Iran of being a bully in that sphere. But let's take a look at the situation in Gaza. What kept this from becoming a Middle East war of huge dimensions? I would argue it was that we placed American military power in the area. We defended the area from dangers of a much larger war. And we provided what is essentially a free good to the countries of the region. I think if you ask Saudis to honestly answer the question, they would tell you how grateful they were that the United States intervened and made clear to Iran and others that this would not become a regional conflict. And so I think we provide this free good of American military power all over the world. And we intervene where necessary to try and keep the peace. So I do not see this as a negative for the United States. It can be. But if you look at American military power on the Korean Peninsula, it has kept the peace. And tremendous influence with the South Korean people and others within the region. We have kept the peace in the Taiwan Strait, and the influence we have with the Taiwan people is, of course, great. In terms of the trade surpluses and deficits, I must say I actually got this idea from a Chinese academic in Hong Kong on another debate stage where he made the case that China running these surpluses does not help its image around the world, that it looks exploitive of other countries. And of course, recently, the Chinese overcapacity issue has become even greater. For example, in the development of EVs, while China clearly has a huge ability to send EVs abroad and people are buying them, what does that do to local manufacture in India or Indonesia or these other countries and developing of their own manufacturing capabilities? I would argue it strangles them in the grave. So I think that this overcapacity problem of China's, which is increasing, not decreasing, is indeed a problem for Chinese positive influence around the world. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Okay, well, let's move to questions. I have at least one question from online, which I could start with while people here in the room start thinking. Stephen Schinkel at the Naval War College asks, when talking about the PRC U.S. global influence in the future, what are your thoughts on this in international organizations such as the WTO, UN, and regional organizations, and how this influence will be important to shaping the international order? Either one of you, whoever wants to go first.
Well, this can provide a good argument for the case 4, this new administration has again withdrawn from a range of international organizations, including the WTO, Paris Agreement, United Nations Human Rights Council, and so on. So again, I think this is a self-forfeiting of American influence in global governance institutions. I would say you will definitely to the benefit of China, although I think China, probably would not need to kind of aggressively fill the shoes of the U.S. because China's influence in global governance institutions is already very big. I think over the past decade, China has adopted conscious strategy to increase its influence in global governance, especially in international institutions. The UN is China is an extremely strong supporter of the UN and has invested a lot in shoring up the UN system. But apart from the UN, China has also devoted a lot of efforts to institution building, including the BRICS. Existing institutions such as BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but also in creating new institutions, the most famous of which is perhaps the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So those institutions are part of a very important pillar of global governance. And what the Trump administration is doing is to forfeit U.S. responsibilities. China, I think, takes very seriously its role in the institutional structure of global governance.
Well, there's a reason I stayed away from this topic in my argumentation. I concede this point. I think that the current American attitude toward international organizations, I do not understand the logic, to be honest with you, of the Trump administration. I do not understand why Trump has so much difficulty with the concept of the international community and working together. I do understand his feeling that the United States has contributed far more than its fair share to some of these organizations, but I think there was reason for that. I think we wanted to promote these organizations. Indeed, the United Nations, we certainly were very eager to found the United Nations, the WTO, the World Bank, and other things. So I think this is an area where China's influence will grow. I concede the point on this particular area that, in my view, the United States is making a mistake.
Chris McRae, Norman McRae Foundation. Could I ask you a population question about the younger half of the world, which I haven't heard much about so far? It would seem to me that the younger half of the world can see there's extraordinary technology, but it's not necessarily being used in education or health or things which maybe matter most to them. So far, the UN goals seem to be collapsing over the last 30 years. So how does influence and, the younger half of the world's needs connect with your argument, if at all?
I think younger half of the world, do you mean sort of developing countries? Is that? No. Oh, okay, yeah, okay. Younger people, how does this relate to, younger population?
I wasn't sure I wanted to go here, but in the terms of soft power, one of the interesting things among younger populations is how, for example, Taylor Swift is so popular among young people all over the world. I think this is an element of American soft power that we often forget, that our movies, our music, these areas really do affect young people globally and give a more positive image of the United States than sometimes the U.S. government can. This is passive influence. This is not design. Taylor Swift is not being sent out by the United States government. Maybe we should be, but we're not. So I do think that there are these elements. I mean, another country, frankly, who I think has done very well in this regard is South Korea. South Korean movies, South Korean dramas, South Korean music. The soft power of South Korea today among young people is actually quite extraordinary.
Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Nayan. I'm from Voice of America. I cover US-China relations and Chinese foreign policy, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. I have a question each for the panelists. To Dr. Fang first, you briefly mentioned some mistakes that China should avoid if it wants to have more influence than the US. What exactly did you mean by that? Do you mean foreign policy, something in the Taiwan Strait or in the South China Sea, or some domestic issues? And to Mr. Wilder, there's a sense at least in the developing nation, I don't want to use the word global south, it's just another word for third world. There is a sense that the US still has a colonial hangover. I'll give you an example. The Fiji Prime Minister was in DC last week. He's been here for a week now. And there was no meeting planned with either President Trump or Secretary of State Marco Rubio. As against when he went to China, he had a meeting with President Xi as well as the Premier. Do you think there's a need for a change in attitude when the US deals with developing nations in Latin America or in Asia or Africa? Thank you.
You want to answer that, or shall I ask another? Okay.
Yeah, so when I mentioned that China should avoid gratuitous mistakes, I primarily mean, the perception that is quite widespread, especially in the US and the West, that China's relationships with its Asian neighbors has been rocky from time to time over the past decade. But at the top-level design, national policy, the principle is clear. China wants to improve relationships with its neighbors. So I think that is the direction that it should take. I think the problem probably lies in policy implementation. And we heard the discourse about war diplomacy and so on. So I think what I primarily mean is to further improve its relations with its neighbors. And there are encouraging signs. I think since late last year, China has been consciously trying to improve relations with its neighbors, especially we have examples of improved relations with India. There was a border disengage agreement last October. And also with Japan, there was a leaders summit in November. And far south with Australia, I think the trade relationship has more or less returned to normal. Southeast Asia, I think the main issue here is the sovereignty and territorial disputes in the South China Sea, especially with the Philippines. So that is an issue to be managed. But otherwise, with other Southeast Asian countries, I think China's relationships with them are more or less stable. So I'm always in favor of influence in a good way. I'm always in favor of more persuasion, more develop diplomatic skills to enhance relationships with the governments and people in those countries and regions.
Thank you for your really good question on what you called colonial hangover. I've studied this question a lot, and I think it's less about colonial hangover than it is a problem with American exceptionalism. We see ourselves as the city on the hill, the best democracy ever, the greatest economy. I mean, We have all these images of ourselves, and it can lead to this kind of hubris that countries should just automatically think we're wonderful. And why don't they? After all, we are, you know. So I think this is a very real American problem. When you are the great superpower, you can become pretty enamored of yourself. And little countries like, was it Fiji? I can't remember. Yeah, Fiji, you know, a little spot on the earth doesn't necessarily deserve our attention. So I think we always, in the United States, this is something we have to look out for, and it is hard to resolve because it is in our DNA to believe in ourselves in a very big way.
Since this is an academic institution, when we talk about power and influence, you have talked about the basis of power, military or economic, but there's also the domain of power. So I'd like to know your views about domain, both from the American and from the Chinese point of view, if you're comparing the two. What domain of power and influence are you talking about? I'm talking about influence, voting in the United Nations, joining in sanctions, military alliance, using Huawei versus a Western platform for telecom, using TikTok versus Twitter or X. These are all influence, areas of influence, domains of influence. Which one are you talking about when you say China would have a greater influence? Just as before I conclude, I would just like to point out one thing which supports something that Zhang Feng said about military power being very counterproductive. The most glaring example of that was Nixon's use of the carrier fleet against India during the Bangladesh war. It didn't stop India from blockading the ports of Pakistan and carrying out its operation, and it lost. India became very much anti-US as far as foreign policy for 30 years, just because they tried to use military influence for something, for a domestic or a regional dispute.
Hello, I'm Dr. LG from CIFAI, private sector. My question is, what is the influence between the US and China in terms of scientific and technical advances, especially now in the era of AI and quantum computing?
Hi, thanks you guys for coming here. My name is Claire. I'm a China analyst at Jane's. One thing that you mentioned, Mr. Zhang, that I thought was interesting was that economic influence is like one of the detractors of, having good positive influence around the world. But there's also like a negative side to that. It's like a double-edged sword. One thing I noticed on a personal trip, I went to Pakistan and Afghanistan in October of last year. And one thing I noticed when we were driving up on the north is that there were grave signs of US-PAC friendship with like X's over it. So there was some like local pushback against Chinese influence and friendship in Pakistan. And when I was talking with some of the locals in both Pakistan and Afghanistan, I felt a majority negative over positive of that. So I was wondering if you could speak to the negative side effects of economic influence in a country. And then for Dennis, a question on under the Trump administration, do you think that the United States would support a competitive option to the BRI that is backed by the United States? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jie Gao. Currently are a Asia Society alumni of Georgetown, and my question is also similar to the kind of influencing different domains. I want to ask both of the panelists about the different influencing across the regions. So for example, Asia Society just launched a global public opinion on China interactive website, and it shows that China has a very kind of generally positive view in Africa. So I wonder, like, when you are asked, greater global influence, I mean, there must be some like different regional like responses too. So I wonder if you can list your, for example, top 3 regions that you think China will definitely have a greater global influence than US, or vice versa, like US will definitely have a greater influence. So thank you.
Also CSIS intern alumni, let's not forget. You have plenty of questions to take on. Dennis, do you want to go first?
Sure. On the question of scientific influence, I think we forget that China has been sending hundreds of thousands of their students to American universities to learn science and technology. Currently, we have still over 260,000 Chinese students a year at American universities. At my own university, with only 20,000 students, we have 1,000 Chinese students on campus. I guarantee you they're not doing political science. So we are continuing to train the world's scientists and people in STEM in the United States, and we still have far and away the top universities in science and technology. There's just no question about that. So our influence in this area is still extremely strong. I don't see people rushing to China to study at Chinese universities in the sciences and technologies in the way that they do come to America and to Canada and to the UK and other Western countries. In terms of this question of regional influence, I think it's a great question, and it's clear we are losing the influence battle in Africa. I don't think there's any question that the United States, our failure to take seriously our need to help with food security, with the debt problems of Africa, has tarnished our image in many African countries. I think that's where we really suffer. I think it's much more mixed in South America. I think in Southeast Asia, frankly, we are actually in a good position. I mean, Cambodia and Laos, yes, but most of Southeast Asia, we continue to be a partner of choice. We have just opened a campus in Jakarta of Georgetown University to train the foreign service of the Indonesians. I think that's a sign of where Indonesia stands. So I think it varies around the world.
Well, I think these are very good set of questions. It brings up the whole conceptual question about power and influence. I think apart from the basic definition of influence, which I would give as the ability to get others to do what you would want them, they would otherwise not do, and prevent them from doing something that they otherwise would. We should also, as you pointed out, differentiate among the domains of influence and also the regions of influence. So in terms of domains, I would still rank China as in a pretty favorable position, especially in the domains of global economic influence and global institutional influence. The institutional influence is connected with global governance issues. And these domains of influence are also related to the regions of influence. And I fully agree with Dennis that in Africa, for example, China has a lot more influence than America. And this influence rests really on economic power, I think. And Dennis pointed out Southeast Asia is an interesting region because the competition between the two countries seems particularly intense, right? I think China holds kind of the upper hand again in economic, because I think I mentioned China's economic advantage so many times because that really is where China's key leverage lies. We talk about military power and how China lags behind the U.S. military power in significant ways. But economic advantage is a different story, especially in Asia. China is Asia's resident power. It has accumulated economic advantages over many decades, and now it's also building a strategic cloud. So the story in Southeast Asia is still unfolding. But I would say probably the U.S. shouldn't be overestimating U.S. strategic influence. In a country like Vietnam, for example, Vietnam is quoting the U.S. for sure, but also considers China as very important because Vietnam is after one-party state. And regime survival, political stability, China is going to be a lot more helpful to Hanoi than the U.S. can ever be. And another region that we haven't touched upon, but I think is also a good example of China's rising influence, is Central Asia. The U.S. has been rapidly losing influence in Central Asia ever since, well, actually predate the withdrawal from Afghanistan, but after the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan, I think it practically at the moment it doesn't have much influence. The Middle East, again, is a very interesting story. Of course, if we're talking about strategic military relations, of course, U.S. military hegemony, as Dennis mentioned, the U.S. military power keeping the region stable, although this raises the question of why the region was unstable in the first place. But China's economic power and the technical assistance that China is able to provide to a whole range, a wide array of Middle Eastern countries, these cannot, I don't think the U.S. can match the scale of Chinese influence in those domains. So I think you raise a really excellent question. We need to be clear about the domain of influence, region of influence, and also the tools of influence.
I think we have time for one more question if anybody feels so inclined. I think maybe there's, oh.
I think you agree. I think there was someone over here.
Yeah, I think there's somebody over there maybe. Yeah, and then Bonnie.
Hi, hello, and thank you for both speakers. I'm Peter, an intern of the CSIS China Power Project. And the question I have for you surrounds the information order, which is another domain of global influence. And this is really disseminated from various sources, including our friends from the media today, social media networks, and increasingly from the responses we get from AI queries. And so on that note, my question to both of you is, China is really striving to tell its own narrative. In other words, 讲好中国故事. So by 2030, who will be better able to do that, the United States or China? Thank you.
Well, I think in this area, there's a huge difference between the two countries and how we approach this. China's state media is very deliberate, and a huge amount of resources have gone into this. Anywhere I go in the world, I turn on a TV set and I can get CGTN. I can't get Fox everywhere in the world, I can tell you that. Chinese Xinhua bureaus are everywhere. And so I think China has done a really very credible job in information warfare here. The difficulty I have with it is there's a lot of disinformation that comes through from Xinhua and People's Daily, and so I think they are maliciously interfering in other countries through the use of these media outlets. America, we have not put our priority on this kind of thing. We have small operations like Radio Free Asia, like Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, Korea Service, and other services that are specifically designed to get information into areas of the world where free information does not flow. But we rely on the global media. We rely on the news services like AP and others to get the message out. So I think it's very different. I do think China has, again, in places like the third world or global south, this is an advantage that they have, that they are able to put media so readily into people's hands. But, I think you have to evaluate the quality of what is being sent out to the world. And I think China's way of propaganda is not a way I want the United States to pursue.
Yeah, good question. I used to think that China's state-driven approach to increase its informational influence, let's use that term, has not been very effective for some of the reasons that Dennis has mentioned. But I think maybe that conclusion was a bit premature, because we do need a period of time in order to assess the effectiveness of the state-led efforts. And I would like to cite latest research from my colleague at Yale University, Professor Dan Mattingly, did a 70-country survey experiment measuring the influence of China's information campaigns by looking exactly at the TV programs like what Dennis mentioned. And they actually find that the Chinese approach has been pretty effective. So, this leads us to see things in a new way. But I think the other point remains. There's the U.S. Often relies on civil society organizations, the global media and news organizations to drive information campaign, where China is seriously deficient in this part of the effort. Civil society organizations, whether news media, NGOs, or other things, to increase the information influence. So I think here the jury is still out, but I think there's no question that China commands enormous resource to conduct state-led campaigns, to present an appealing narrative, especially to countries in the global south. And we should not underestimate the long-term effectiveness of those campaigns.
Just a quick plug that Big Data China, our CSIS initiative, we did cover this topic, and we wrote a feature which included a review of the paper that you mentioned, the Mattingly paper. So just people are interested. Bonnie, very quick, if you have a last question.
Yeah, thank you. I actually have two questions based off of the initial remarks that Zhang Feng and Dennis provided. So Dennis, I was wondering if you wanted to weigh in on Zhang Feng's initial argument that the quality of domestic institutions and governance in China is what make China more influential than the United States by 2030. And then Zhang Feng, I wanted you to see if you wanted to respond to what Dennis mentioned in terms of, is China ready to step up? And linking that to the first debate in which Rick Waters talked about U.S. roles and the role of key U.S. allies and partners in Ukraine and in the Middle East. To what extent, if the United States is doing less, is China even willing to play a role and step up in some of the key roles that the United States plays in maintaining global order? Thank you.
I do recognize the fact that China has taken great advantage of what they call the chaos of American democracy to indicate to other countries who they believe they can influence that the Chinese model is better, that it is stable, that it is harmonious, that the citizenry feels safer in Chinese cities than in American cities, and all of these things. I'm not sure, though, that that resonates as much as China may think it resonates around the world. I think there is a great deal of respect for a system like the American system, where you can change governments every 4 years, you can debate the issues very openly in your society, you can debate the evils of your society quite clearly. And so I think that this argument that somehow because China through authoritarian means looks more stable, I would ask whether really around the world people would prefer to live there than in a free society.
Yeah, thanks, Bonnie, for the question. First of all, I think there's a question of, exactly what kind of gap that the U.S. has left for China to fill in. Looking at the Middle East, for example, President Trump clearly has his own ideas, very clear. Although very unconventional, but clearly he thinks he can solve the problem. He doesn't want China to solve those hot security issues in the Middle East. And I don't think China would have the appetite to wade into the security issues. Although, as I mentioned, on the economic side, China has invested a lot in the Middle Eastern countries. On the other issues, Ukraine, again, the Trump administration, as I read the news, is devising a plan for ceasefire at least to end the Ukraine war, and China doesn't appear to be a central part of it. So I actually question what kind of gap actually there is, what kind of space there is for China really to play a very, very important role. If we look at North Korea, that's next door to China, so presumably China can play a very big role here. But if you look back at what happened during the first Trump administration, I think initially President Trump really wanted China to help deal with North Korea. But in the end, he relied a lot more on South Korea, and he had 3 personal summit meetings with North Korean leader. So I actually am not sure that there's a very large space. Even from on the part of the intention of President Trump or his team for China really to step in decisively to kind of help solve those problems. On global strategic issues, I would actually circle back to Dennis's point, especially involving a strong military component. The solution really lies in America.
Okay, any final remarks before we turn back to voting? A couple of minutes each. Anything that might sway the public towards your...
I just remind you of how you voted the first time. You don't want to be a waffler here, okay? No, I think that this has been very useful in illuminating, because there are areas where China's influence is growing in the world, and I think I would concede that point. But wisely, the designers of the proposition have said that by 2030, China will have greater global influence than the United States. So I would just remind you of that before you vote.
Well, I hope you would, could have reframed the question instead of 2030, maybe 2049. That would create an easier job for me.
Any other remarks, closing remarks for you? No. Okay. I guess back to Truly for voting.
Just a reminder, polling is now live. You can either use the shortened URL code on the left-hand side or the QR code on the right-hand side. If you have any questions, just feel free to raise your hand and I can come around.
It's not looking great for you, John Fung. I'll be honest.
It's about the same.
Yeah, it's the same voting.
Yeah.
What were our numbers last time?
Is that it? Everybody voted? I see some more people with their phones up, so.
revolution if you voted otherwise, right?
Certainly in Washington, D.C.,
Yeah.
that would be.
Yeah, the audience was skewed, I think.
Great, okay. This is the final count, so 64% to 36%. We may have had a little bit slight shift. I can't remember exactly the numbers. So you were certainly convincing, Zhangfeng, but I think Dennis's arguments have won the day. Thank you all very much. I think we're taking a break for lunch, but we'll be back soon with more debates. Thank you.